All right, welcome everyone. Today's presentation on an overview of the DPI Special Education Evaluation Bulletin, and we are also going to be providing an update on the disability category criteria worksheets. My name is Daniel Parker. I'm an assistant director on the special education team at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and we have many presenters with us today helping out with this presentation from the special education team and various discretionary grant projects. Our learning objectives today are to understand the importance of information update, the Special Education Evaluation Bulletin as it relates to educational equity. We're going to highlight some selected questions and answers from the bulletin. Next, we will review the revised disability category criteria worksheets. And then at the end, we'll have a chance to reflect, brainstorm, think how we're going to apply the information from today, and an opportunity for all of you to ask questions. And at the end, there's a few additional resources that we'll share. I wanted to begin today to remember that the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction acknowledges and honors the inherent sovereignty of each of the American Indian nations of Wisconsin. I'm joining you from Madison, Wisconsin, and the land I am here for today's event is that of the Ho-Chunk people and nation, who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. The DPI will continue to cultivate and maintain our ongoing collaboration and partnerships with all of Wisconsin's indigenous nations, people and communities of Wisconsin. This slide has several resources to learn more about Wisconsin's indigenous nations. I would really encourage you to, after the webinar, check out this slide, click on some of the links. There's information from our American Indian Studies program and other resources, and it can assist you with steps to actively cultivate and collaborate with these American Indian nations. And we encourage you again to take a look at these at the end of the webinar. Today's presentation covers the following high leverage practices in special education. If you want to learn more about the Cedar Center and the Council for Exceptional Children's high leverage practices in special education, I would encourage you just to kind of do a web search for Cedar Center and CEC high leverage practices in special education. They have a lot of really good resources, and we do align our professional learning with their high leverage practices. All right. With that, our first learning objective today is to understand the importance of Bulletin 2101, special education evaluation as it relates to educational equity. It's good to remind ourselves that as educators, we must ground all of our work within an equity framework. Doing this ensures every student has access to the resources they need, when they need it, and the way they need it, and at the time that they need it, across race, gender, ethnicity, language, ability, sexual orientation, family background, or family income. Grounding all of our work within an equity framework includes how we identify students with disabilities. Specifically, I just want to take a moment to think about some specific actions that we are taking. And specifically, how are we better serving the most under-resourced and inequitably served students and family? We want to provide students with what they need when they need it in the way they need it. And this is especially acute challenge for students of color and students with disability. We need to make sure that we are thinking of those students who are often the most under-resourced and inequitably served students and families. For decades, we have been aware of the disproportionate disability identification of certain groups of students. We also know that many of these students are more often removed from general education instruction and have worse educational outcomes than their white peers without IEPs. So when students receive special education services that they do not need, such as not being accurately evaluated or identified, or when they're receiving special education services that are ineffective, they are not getting what they need when they need it and the way they need it. So this is what we mean by under-resourced and inequitably served. When we have a focus on equity, we push back on individual and system biases and stereotypes that affect educational decision-making. And for each student, ask ourselves, are the educational services being provided what this student needs to be successful. So we also want to maintain and deepen relationships with students, families, and colleagues, collaborate in decision-making based on individual student and family needs, and continue to take care of ourselves. This is a message we will be carrying throughout our professional learning series on comprehensive special education evaluation this year. So before we get started, take a moment, type in the chat your thoughts. How do requirements of and processes for identifying and evaluating students with disabilities advance educational equity? Just take a moment to sit with that. Type something in the chat. And as I introduce our speaker to continue on with this section around educational equity and our special education evaluation bulletin and how that fits, please continue to type things into the chat. It's going to be really interesting to take a look at that, and you can look at what other people are putting in there as well. With that, I would like to introduce Patty Williams, one of my colleagues, fellow assistant director on the special education team.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to start out with sort of a grounding in thinking about where things were prior to the enactment of special education laws. So as you can see from the slides, 1967, 200,000 people with significant disabilities were institutionalized. In 1970, 1 in 5 students with disabilities were educated in public schools, so most were not. And you can see that some states had laws restricting access to public education for certain disability categories, including deaf, blind, emotional behavioral disabilities, and developmental disabilities. And so I think it's important to sort of look back prior to these special education laws. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why IDEA is so important and sort of what the foundational pillars are and how this particular bulletin, the Special Education Evaluation Bulletin, fits in. But just to share kind of my own personal story, my own aunt, for example, was denied access to public schools. So, it was prior to 1970, and she wasn't permitted to go to a public school at all. And I think back and I think that if she would have been able to, if she would have received the special education and services that are available, I think she could have had a much more independent life. I think she could have had some employment opportunities, and I think she could have had some independence. So, that's just a personal story in my life, but it affected so many students and families across the United States. So next slide, please. Then in 1975, President Ford signed into law the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. So this was the law that sort of opened the doors and allowed access to public education for students with disabilities. It is now known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. This is, and it's important to recognize and realize, is a piece of civil rights legislation that guarantees students with disabilities access to public education. Next slide, please. So to me, IDEA and why it is so important and such an amazing piece of legislation, it has three, I feel like it has three pillars or cornerstones. The first is it guarantees students with disabilities and access to a free and appropriate public education. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but the IEP is really sort of the heart of providing a free and appropriate public education. It is the program, of course, it has to be implemented, that is designed to allow the student to make progress both towards their goals and toward the general education curriculum. So that is, one really foundation piece of IDEA. The next is, placement decisions and making sure that children with disabilities are not restricted or secluded, but are educated with students without disabilities to the maximum extent possible. And that's, referred to as the least restrictive environment provisions. And then finally, what we're really going to focus on today is the child find requirements. Students with disabilities have to be appropriately identified. They have to be located, evaluated, and identified. And that's part of the child find responsibility that districts have in making sure that children are identified and receive the services and supports they are entitled to. So on March 22nd, 2017, the US Supreme Court decided a case referred to as Endrew F. And this case addressed what is meant by FAPE. And it was the first case that sort of readdressed this issue in 35 years. So it was a landmark decision and a very important decision. And what the decision said is that an IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. So for most cases, this means the child advancing from grade to grade. But if that's not the case, it has to be progress that's appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. It's important that this progress is not diminuous progress, that it is meaningful progress. And so Endrew F. focuses really on looking at the individual needs of the child. And I think that's also another important part. What this case stated and what the court stated is that for most students, in order to provide FAPE, it has to be an IEP designed to allow the student to progress from grade to grade. But if that is not possible, the IEP should be appropriately ambitious in light of the children's circumstances or the child's circumstances. The court noted that goals may differ, but each and every child should have a chance to meet those challenging objectives. The other thing that's important about Endrew F. is that it also highlights that IEPs must be individualized and designed to meet the student's unique disability-related needs. The court stated, and I think this is a really important point to always keep in mind, that an IEP is not a form document, but rather it is constructed only after careful consideration of the particular student. And where IEP teams get information about particular students is through the evaluation process, at least in part. That's going to allow them to have the information needed to develop IEP that's really based on the individual needs of the student. Okay, and so for the next slide, please. So over the last 7 years, Wisconsin DPI has had a renewed focus on educational equity for students with IEPs. And this has resulted in numerous updates to guidance related to developing IEPs, clarifying the roles and responsibilities of local educational agencies, including public school districts and independent charter schools, to provide a free and appropriate public education to students. This guidance is aligned with the Endrew F. decision, emphasizing that IEPs must address the unique disability-related needs of the students. The present-level information determines the disability-related needs, which then drives the goals. Services are linked to the goals, and disability-related needs and progress is continually monitored. The comprehensive evaluation fits into the framework, or the comprehensive education evaluation fits into the framework of Endrew F. and the College and Career Ready IEP, and is a companion piece to the FAPE Bulletin. Just wanted to, for the next slide, I just wanted to cover a couple of the sort of the evaluation requirements and where they come from in the law. So special education evaluation requirements, including the requirement that the evaluation must be sufficiently comprehensive to identify all of the students' special education and related services needs, is found in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, in Wisconsin State Statute, Chapter 115, and Wisconsin PI 11 rules. And as you'll see when you look through the bulletin, these sites are throughout the bulletin, so you can see where that particular requirement comes from. The next slide, please. And then two, important requirements that really cover the bulletin are both the child find requirement that I mentioned before, and that's that LEAs must ensure that all resident students who have not graduated with a regular high school diploma and who may need special education and related services are identified, located, and evaluated according to IDEA. And then with the next slide, you can see how evaluation is identified. And it's identified as procedures used to determine whether a child has a disability and the nature and extent of the special education and related services the child needs. And I think this is an important point to highlight, is that an evaluation is not merely to determine if a child requires special education services, right? If they meet the disability category and then require specially designed instruction, but rather it's also to determine the nature and extent of the services that the child needs, their disability related needs, so that can then develop an effective IEP that addresses the individualized needs of the student. So I think that's it for my introduction, and I think we're next to the next learning objective.